Сега, понеже нямаме много време, ще поканя основния ни лектор, който да си изнесе лекцията, след това ще продължим с откриването. Така или иначе, за всичко има време, въпросът е да намерим желание. Така, само да видим къде се запиля.
I'm so sleepy I'm having trouble deciding whether to stand or sit. I guess that means I should stand. Although my main topic today is not free software, I'd better say something about it at the beginning, because I don't know how much you know about it. Free software, or Svobodna software, means software that respects the user's freedom. Free software is about freedom and community. The freedom to do what you want to do on your own computer, and the freedom to cooperate with other people when you choose to. Proprietary software, that is non-free software, is distributed in a scheme that keeps users divided and helpless. The developer has power over all the users, and that's what makes it evil. That power is what denies the users their freedom. It keeps the users divided and helpless. Divided because every user is forbidden to share with anyone else. And helpless because the users don't have the source code. So they can't change the program. They can't even verify independently what it's really doing. There are many non-free programs that have malicious features. Features that the users would remove if they could, but they can't. Sometimes these features are secret. We don't know about all of them. We just find out about some cases. For instance, many non-free programs spy on the user. One non-free program that you might have heard of that spies on the user is called Windows XP. When the user, I hope you wouldn't use a program like that, when the user of Windows XP searches in her own files for a word, Windows XP sends a message saying what the word was. And when Windows XP asks for an upgrade, it reports to Microsoft all the software installed on that computer. It sends that information encrypted. It required careful investigation to determine that it was sending that list of software. They didn't want people to know this. And malicious features can get much worse than spyware. But the basis for all of them is the fact that the users are divided and helpless. With free software, even if we imagine that the developer is somehow malicious, he couldn't get away with it because the users would simply remove the feature. With free software, the users are in control. The users determine how the software will develop. Free software develops under the democratic control of all its users. Free software, art of human knowledge. There are 4 essential freedoms which define free software. A program is free software if you, the user, have these 4 freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to help yourself. That's the freedom to study the source code and then change it to do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor, the freedom to distribute copies to others. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help your community. The freedom to publish modified versions so others can benefit from your contribution. You're never required to do this. You can make a change and just use it yourself, but you are free to publish it as well. And many people do, and the result is many people are contributing to the improvement of free software. Free software is not an economic issue. Yes, it has secondary economic consequences, but when really important things, such as freedom and community, are at stake, economics is secondary. But you'll be glad to hear that the economic consequence is to reduce the concentration of wealth. Proprietary software is a very powerful system for concentration of wealth, as you can observe by the fact that the richest person in the world was, for a while, the head of a proprietary software company. That's because it's concentrating wealth. Well, what's that doing? That's bad for almost everyone. Free software does not eliminate business, but it removes this tool for concentrating wealth, and that is good for society as well. But I think it's less important than freedom and community. You will find both large and small businesses involved with free software. Most of them are involved as users because they're not in the software field at all. But they use computers, and free software is very useful for them. But if we look just at the computer field, you'll also find large and small companies involved in developing free software. With free software, the developer can't make you pay for permission. Not permission for anything, because you're free. You don't have to beg for permission. However, lots of users want support. And so what software companies tend to do in the free software world is sell support. And that's a legitimate activity because it's not based on first keeping people divided and helpless. If 1,000 people want support, each one has his own question. And what they pay for is for you to answer their questions. That's legitimate. And in this business, nobody is being forced to promise not to help anybody else. They're just doing things for each other. I started the free software movement in 1983. And in January 1984, I began developing a free software operating system called GNU. Now, many of you have seen articles about this operating system, but they probably call it by the wrong name. you've probably seen articles call it Linux. But that's a misnomer. Linux is actually one part of this operating system. It's what's known as the kernel, which is the program that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs that you run. An entire operating system contains hundreds, or maybe by now thousands of programs, and that's what GNU set out to be. Linux was actually the last essential piece that was added to the system in 1992, producing the GNU plus Linux combination. That was the first free operating system for modern computers. And thus, in 1992 was the first time it became possible to use a computer in freedom ever since the 1970s. So, that minimal goal was achieved, and the system began to catch on. People heard that it was powerful and that it was very reliable, that it would run for months without crash. And it was also available at a low price, which is a secondary issue when freedom is at stake, but it's convenient for many people. So we got millions of users, and people started inviting me to give more speeches. And in these speeches, people would sometimes ask me at the end, do these ideas extend to anything other than software? After I had shown the arguments that I don't have time for today, why software must be free, why it is unethical to make a program non-free. Well, often they would ask the question in a deliberately stupid way. They would say, what about computers? What about cars? What about chairs? Should they be free too? Well, what would that mean? Remember, free is defined by these four fundamental freedoms: to use it as you wish, change it as you wish, copy it and distribute the copies, and publish modified versions. Well, with physical objects, you generally are free to use them as you wish. And you are free to change them too, to the extent it's possible. If, lots of people modify their cars. Lots of people modify chairs too. Like you might decide to reupholster the chair. And if it's a wooden chair, and you're really cold one day, you could chop it up and burn it. And no one's going to try to forbid you to make any change in that chair. But what about copying? Well, that's a meaningless question. There are no copiers for physical objects. Maybe in the future, with nanotechnology, we'll have the ability to copy any physical object. If so, this freedom would become a meaningful issue. And questions like the freedom to copy food would become tremendously important to society. Agribusiness companies will try to starve poor people to death by restricting their freedom to copy food. Right now, we see the pharmaceutical companies condemning millions of poor people around the world to death by forbidding the cheap manufacture of life-saving drugs in these poor countries. They're so concerned with their profits that they will kill millions. So I'm sure the agribusiness companies would behave no better in 50 or 100 years if it becomes possible to copy food. In fact, in some cases, in a very limited way, it is possible to copy food, because some of these food objects make seeds, and you can plant them, and more food objects will grow. And the agribusiness companies are trying to prohibit this around the world. They don't care if these farmers die. But mostly you can't copy physical objects. So the question doesn't arise. The question, should chairs or cars be free? Well, they're as free as they possibly could be given today's technology. But the question does make sense if you ask it about other kinds of works. Because works that are made of information can be copied and can be changed. So, the question of the freedom to copy and modify other kinds of works does make sense, and that's what I'm about to speak about, to try to answer that question. Now, proprietary programs usually are restricted by contract law, but other kinds of works are normally restricted only by copyright law. So if anything stops you from changing or copying a work, normally it's copyright law. In addition, software is unusual because it has source code and object code. In order to be able to effectively change software, you've got to have the source code. And so part of free software is that the source code is available. However, other kinds of works generally don't have this distinction. In general, with other kinds of works, if you get the form of the work that an end user might use is the only form. Now, it's not 100% true. A book might have a textual form with markup, and then it might have the form that has been formatted. And the markup is not there, and it looks nice. But the words are still visible. The same words are equally visible in both forms. There's no tremendously important information that you don't see in the formatted book. The markup is just sort of secondary. It's not what's really important in the book. So, because of this, the question of whether other sorts of works are free is just a matter of what copyright law says. So the question of whether other works in some sense should be free is the question of what copyright law ought to say. Now, changes in technology cannot affect the basic principles of ethics. Because the basic principles of ethics are too deep to be touched by something as superficial as a new technology. But when we apply these principles to a specific issue, we look at the consequences of the various choices. And the consequences can be altered by technological change. In general, the consequences can be altered by a change in the context. The technological context today is not the same as it was 50 years ago. So, a policy that was good 50 years ago could be harmful today because it has different effects. And this is what has happened to copyright law. To understand this, we need to look at the history of copyright law and the history of its technological context, which is copying technology. Copying of works started in the ancient world. It was done with a pen and ink. Someone would read a book and write the same words, or try to write the same words. This technology had certain consequences. First of all, it did not require specialized training. Anyone who knew how to read the book could also copy it. about as well as anybody else could. Second, there was no economy of scale. To make 10 copies took 10 times as long as making one copy. Third, it was not limited to making identical copies. In fact, in the ancient world, in between writing a book and copying a book, there were intermediate activities that were respected and useful. For instance, you could start copying a book and then write some new text, and then continue copying, and then write some more new text. This was writing a commentary, and it was respected and useful. You could also write some new text, and then copy a part of the book, and then write some more new text, and copy a part of some other book, and continue. This was writing a compendium, and it was also respected and useful. In fact, there were ancient works that are lost, but large or small parts of them survive because they were copied into compendia that had better luck. Now, as far as I can tell, there was no idea of copyright in the ancient world. If you had a copy of a book, you had a right to copy it. And anyone who wanted to copy a book would do so. But the technology of the ancient world was replaced by a more efficient technology, the printing press. The printing press made copying more efficient, but not uniformly. Instead, some kinds of copying became more efficient, while other kinds were not affected at all. Because the printing press had an inherent economy of scale. It took a lot of work to set the type. Once you had set the type, you could very quickly make many identical copies. So the printing press was only suited to making many identical copies. Furthermore, the printing press was extensive equipment. The press itself and the letters were expensive, and most people who knew how to read did not have printing presses, nor know how to use one. And as a result, we got a centralized system of copying, where copies would be made at particular places and then transported to all the people who wanted them. For the early centuries of printing, it did not completely replace hand copying. Hand copies continued to be made, either for very rich people to show how rich they were, or by poor people, people who couldn't afford a printed copy but had the time to write a copy. Copyright began in the age of the printing press. The earliest reference to copyright that I have seen is from Italy in the 1500s. Apparently, it was possible to ask one of the local princes to give you a monopoly on copying something. And you didn't have to be the author of it necessarily, but it started to be a sort of custom that if the prince liked you and you wrote a book, he would give you a monopoly on copying it. Princes in those days used to give their favorites monopolies on all sorts of things. It was one of the ways that they recruited their support so as to remain in power. Hand out monopolies to whoever was supporting them. Copyright in the modern world is to a large extent influenced by copyright in England, which started out in the late 1500s as a monopoly given to publishers, a perpetual monopoly. And this was partly a system of censorship as well. However, in the 1700s it was reformed, and copyrights were given for the first time as a matter of legal requirements to authors, and for a limited time only. When the U.S. Constitution was written, there was a suggestion that authors should be entitled to copyrights. This suggestion was rejected. Although to hear the publishers speak, you would never guess that. But you can see it by looking at the U.S. Constitution, which says that Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by reserving to authors and inventors for a limited time the exclusive use of their respective writings and inventions. So this indicates a few decisions that were made. One was it did not require a copyright system. It merely authorized one optionally. Second, it stated clearly what the purpose was. The purpose was to promote progress, a public benefit. So it is explicitly stated that copyright, in the US at least, does not exist for the sake of the authors, let alone for the sake of the publishers. It exists for the sake of a public benefit. And so copyright was described as a bargain, a deal between the public and authors. The public gave up certain freedoms and in exchange got certain benefits. The benefits of more writing, which meant not only more books available in bookstores, but also more conversation about social issues, which helps society, or used to help society, decide how to deal with public issues. So this was a tremendous step forward. Now, around 1900, printing presses became a lot more efficient. Printed copies of books became a lot cheaper, and even poor people stopped copying books by hand. But this didn't alter the fundamental nature of copyright. It was an industrial regulation. And that's very important. You see, it was an industrial regulation because it restricted publishers. It didn't restrict ordinary readers. During the 1800s, nobody ever tried to enforce copyright against poor people who copied books by hand, because it was understood as an industrial regulation. And this had three important consequences. First of all, copyright was fairly painless. It was easy to enforce, and it was arguably beneficial for the public. It was fairly painless because the general public was not restricted by it. If you weren't a publisher, copyright didn't stop you from doing anything. So why would you complain? Second, it was easy to enforce because it only had to be enforced against publishers. And it was easy to find whoever was publishing a book. Just go look and see who's selling copies and see where they came from. It wasn't necessary to invade every person's house or every person's computer to enforce copyright. If you're carrying a personal tracking and surveillance device, please switch it off. They have already tracked you here. They already know you're listening to me. So it's not necessary to keep them informed minute by minute while you're sitting and listening to me, and it would be polite to everyone else to switch it off. So, copyright was fairly painless, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial because the public was trading away freedoms that it couldn't exercise anyway. So it lost nothing. And in exchange got those public benefits of more writing. But the age of the printing press is giving way to the age of the computer networks. This advance in copying technology makes copying more efficient, just as the printing press made copying more efficient. And just like the printing press, it does not do so uniformly. The printing press made some kinds of copying more efficient, mass production of identical copies. Digital technology also has a non-uniform effect. The opposite. It makes all the rest of copying more efficient. And brings us back, therefore, to a situation more like the ancient world, where the tremendous efficiency of mass production is gone. Not completely gone. It's true that making thousands of identical CDs is cheaper than making CDs one at a time. But making CDs one at a time is cheap enough. So, there is no longer a great obstacle to making copies one by one. It's easy, and millions of people do it. The benefits of digital information technology are that it makes it easy to copy and manipulate information. The publishers do not want this to be easy for you. They want to monopolize the benefits of digital information technology and dribble them out to you solely under their control. In the age of the printing press, the public traded away certain freedoms under copyright law, freedoms which the public couldn't exercise anyway. So, this is why it was effectively an industrial regulation, why it was painless, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial. But with computers today, we can all exercise those freedoms. These freedoms have become very useful to hundreds of millions of people, and they want to use these freedoms, to exercise these freedoms. What do you do if you have been producing a certain byproduct that's useless to you, so you have been in the habit of selling it to someone else? And then you discover a way to use it yourself. What do? It's obvious. You keep it, or you keep part of it. Maybe you don't need it all. Maybe you still want to sell part of it, but you keep the part that you want to use. And that's what the public generally wants to do in regard to the freedom to copy. In the age of the printing press, copyright was effectively an industrial regulation because it only restricted publishers. But today, the same words in copyright law restrict everyone. There are restrictions now on ordinary citizens, which means that copyright is no longer effectively an industrial regulation. And therefore, it is no longer painless for the public. It is no longer easy to enforce, and it's no longer arguably beneficial. It's no longer painless for the general public because it's now being used to restrict every citizen. to stop these citizens from doing things like sharing music on the internet, which they want to do. It's no longer easy to enforce because enforcing copyright now requires invading everyone's house and everyone's computer. And harsh threats are being made against individuals who have done nothing but share with each other. We find in the US college students being sued for more money than they're likely to see in their whole lives. This is really harsh. Of course, it's not as harsh as what we've seen the proprietary software developers do in some countries, where they have threatened people with being raped. And it's no longer arguably beneficial because the freedoms that people are giving up now are valuable and the people want to keep them, not sell them. So, what should we do? Obviously, we should revise the deal that we've made. We should arrange to keep part of these freedoms. Exactly how much, I'll get to. But the point is, clearly we should keep part of this freedom, all of us, to exercise it, and perhaps trade away just part of the freedom instead of all of it. And so, democratic governments, if we had democratic governments, would be changing copyright law to reduce the power of copyright, to legalize the copying that citizens want to do. But in fact, what we see is just the opposite. What we see is around the world, governments are making copyright law more strict, giving publishers more power, taking away part of the freedom that the citizens used to retain. And this is a sign of the sickness of democracy. It's a sign that businesses have more power than the citizens. And in this particular area, the businesses that lobby for changes are the publishers. Book publishers, record companies, movie companies, they all want more power. And so what we see is that copyright is being made more strict than ever. Copyright power is extended to an unprecedented degree. One dimension that's being extended is the length of time. Copyright in the US used to last for 28 years, renewable once. A few decades ago, and it was extended over and over and over. The last extension was in 1998. Copyright was extended by 20 years, not just for new works, but even for old works. And this is supposed to provide further incentive for writing. But I just don't see how dead authors are going to write more books in the 1920s because they know that their great-grandchildren will get 20 more years of copyright lasting somewhere into the 21st century. If they have a time machine available, I wish they would tell us. Now, theoretically speaking, 20 more years of copyright on new works might perhaps provide an additional incentive. Copyright on works made by companies formerly lasted 75 years. They extended it to 95 years. Any business that wants to claim this is going to make a difference ought to substantiate its claims by presenting its projected balance sheets for 76 years in the future. Of course, they can't do that. They don't even project 10 years ahead. So it was all nonsense. It was simply a way to grab additional power. They had a monopoly. The monopoly was supposed to go away. They didn't want it to go away, so they contributed campaign funds to the legislators, and they got the law they wanted. It's as simple as that. Laws in the United States are for sale. You may have heard some of the scandals connected with Representative Tom DeLay. One of them is that his assistants were shopping around votes, laws, in exchange for campaign contributions. And they even wrote it down. So, in 1998, this law was passed extending copyright by 20 years. And around 2018, they're going to try to do it again. Because the U.S. Constitution says copyright has to last for a limited time. But the movie companies have said that they want perpetual copyright. Well, in order to get perpetual copyright, they'd have to amend the Constitution, and that's difficult. So they came up with a way to get the same result without admitting it. Perpetual copyright on the installment plan. Every 20 years, they extend copyright for 20 more years. So if you look at any particular work today, supposedly there is some date at which that work will go into the public domain. But don't hold your breath. Because by the time you get to that date, copyright will have been extended to another date 20 years later, and by the time you get there, it will have been extended again. And this way, they hope, nothing will ever fall into the public domain again. That's their goal. Another dimension of copyright is what activities it covers. In the age of the printing press, copyright was never intended to cover all uses of a published copyrighted work. Copyright was the exception within a space of free, unregulated use. But now, the publishers are trying to get total power over all use of works. And in 1998, in the US, was the first place they got it. They passed a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which effectively authorized publishers to write their own copyright law by implementing it in some kind of player or reader program. Whatever restrictions they implemented in these players or readers effectively take the force of law, because it's illegal to distribute anything that bypasses those restrictions. And thus, in the US, the free software that can view the video on a DVD has been censored. Under this law, it's illegal. It's illegal to distribute it. And it's illegal even to tell people where to get it by making a link to some site that distributes it. So the US now has censorship. The format of videos on DVDs was initially a secret. This was a plan to force all the makers of DVD players to include the same restrictions. The organization that maintained the secret, which worked for the movie companies, would not disclose the secret to any electronics company unless the company promised to impose the restrictions. that were required. And thus all the DVD players have these restrictions, and there has been essentially no progress in DVD players ever since they first came out. This format was a secret, but a few people in Europe figured it out. And then they wrote a free program to do the job. And now that program is censored in the United States. Most of these people were anonymous, but one of them is known. His name is Jon Johansen, and he lives in Norway. At the time, he was 16 years old, and he was put on trial by the Norwegian government at the request of Washington. But the courts ruled that what he did was not illegal. Now, the Norwegian government is trying to make it illegal. In fact, many governments have made it illegal. The European Union has adopted a directive that says it has to be illegal to commercially distribute such software. You see, when there's something wrong in the United States, the US government does not try to solve the problem. Instead, it tries to impose the problem on the rest of the world. The US government is actively pressuring other countries to prohibit these programs too. The US government regularly pressures other countries to take away their citizens' freedom, and not just in this area. A few months ago, I visited Morocco, and I was told that their latest king had decided to establish many kinds of civil liberties. And then the US government said, "You are showing too much respect for the rights of the accused. Take some away." So they did. The US government is the greatest enemy of human rights in the world today. There are other governments that regularly deny their citizens more human rights than the US government does, but they have less influence on the rest of the world. And one specific little area of this is copyright policy, where your freedom to use your computer as you wish, to view the movie on a DVD or access other restricted, encrypted media, are being taken away. Last December, I was in Spain, and I was hosted by the government of a region, the Basque region of Spain. And my host gave me some things to promote their awareness of their region. And one was a record of music by a musician I'd heard of, but I'd never heard his music. So I wanted to listen to it, and I saw on the cover it said, "Copy Control." And then it said, "This record can be played in Windows and Macintosh systems." Meaning that it can't be played on a free operating system, because the software to play it is prohibited, because it's not a CD, it's not a compact disc, it's a corrupt disc. It's something that looks like a CD, and some CD players will play it, but not all, because it doesn't follow the standard. And in fact, it can't legally be called a compact disc in many countries in Europe. That's why it actually says on the cover that it's not one. So once I saw that, I didn't open it. I gave it back to my host and I said, "Here you see the face of the enemy. Please take this back to the store because they shouldn't keep your money. Don't buy corrupt discs." I think it's essential for people to spend some of their time standing in front of record stores, handing out papers saying, "Don't buy corrupt discs," and explaining why. This way we can fight back against this attempt to restrict us. Let me read to you what these record companies are doing. I want to read to you what EMI said to its customers. If you plan to continue protesting about future audio media releases with copy protection, forget it. Copy protection is a reality, and within a matter of months, more or less, all audio media worldwide are copy protected. And this is a good thing for the music industry. In order to make this happen, we will do anything within our power, whether you like it or not. This is a translation from German. I am told that the original German was much nastier, but that it's impossible to do justice to it in English. Meanwhile, books are not immune to this problem too. A few years ago, there was a massive campaign to convince people to stop buying paper books and buy e-books instead. This campaign, I am certain, was carefully orchestrated. How do I know? I was sitting in an airplane in Brazil, and I pulled out the in-flight magazine, which was half Portuguese and half English. And it had a prominent article talking about how great e-books were going to be. And they wouldn't have done that if they hadn't been paid to print that. So somebody was going around paying to put articles in favor of e-books wherever they could get it. Why do the publishers want us to stop reading paper books and read e-books? Well, with paper books, we have certain freedoms still. Freedoms that we've enjoyed for a long time. The freedom to buy a book from a used bookstore. The freedom to lend it to a friend. The freedom to buy a book anonymously by paying cash. The freedom to borrow a book from the public library. And the freedom to keep the book for years or decades and read it again, and maybe even pass it on to our children who might read it again. All these freedoms would be taken away if we switched to e-books. The publishers would love to take these freedoms away, but that's hard. You see, there are millions of people who read books, and they might get angry. Democracy is very sick, but when millions of people get angry, democracy might function. So the publishers can't really pass a law taking away these freedoms for printed books. So they came up with a two-stage plan to get the same result. The first stage was to take away these freedoms for e-books, which was easy because there were no e-books and there were no readers to get angry. And the second stage was convince people to switch from paper books to e-books. And at the same time, they lose their freedom. The hope was that e-books would be so sexy and attractive that people wouldn't think about the change in their freedom until it was too late. E-books were a failure commercially. Why? I don't know. I wish I could believe it was because people valued their freedom too much. But I don't think so. I suspect it was some other reason, some aspect of convenience. And I'm sure they're going to try again. There is still a pressure campaign trying to promote e-books. I got a message from an organization. Some people put me on mailing lists, and I got a message from one of them trying to encourage people to make e-books instead of printed books last week. We're going to have to fight that battle again. So this is what's happening. Copyright is being made more strict and restrictive. The freedoms that citizens used to have are being taken away. But what would our governments do if they were democratic? Well, one thing they would do is what they would do basically is they would reduce copyright power. I just realized I made a mistake. I left my alarm clock in the hotel room. So I better ask if someone could go back there and get it. It's a black plastic thing that folds. And it's probably near to my bed. Let me double check. Yeah, it's not here, so. I'm rather sleepy. So, we should reduce copyright power in all these different dimensions. We should reduce how long it lasts. And we should reduce how broad the power is. As for the length of time, one thing we can see is that the publication cycle is getting faster and faster. Nowadays in the US, the typical book is remaindered within 2 years, and it's out of print within 3 years. So I don't believe that many decades of copyright can be necessary. Let's reduce copyright to last for 10 years, starting with the date of publication. That should be plenty. Now, that might be more than necessary, and if so, a few years later, we could see if we want to reduce it further. But I think 10 years is a good first step. It's still quite a bit longer than the publication period. This proposal, however, is controversial. Once I was sitting in a panel with some authors, and I made this proposal, and the award-winning author sitting next to me said, 10 years is impossible, intolerable. Anything more than 5 years is outrageous. Now, you might be surprised that an author would say that. I was surprised. I assumed naively that authors were in favor of longer copyright. But no, you see, it turns out that the same publishers who are taking away our freedom in the name of those authors and artists are grinding those same authors and artists into the ground with their heels all the time. this author had a clause in his contract, which is more or less standard in the US at least, that when the book goes out of print, the rights revert to him and he can use the book as he wants. But as often happens, the publisher had let the book effectively go out of print but was refusing to admit it, refusing to recognize it. And as a result, he was not allowed to use his own book as he wanted to. And it wasn't available. He wanted people at least to be able to read his book. So after we've reduced it to 10 years, we could think again a few years later about maybe reducing it to 5 years. The other dimension is what activities are restricted by copyright. And here, I think it's crucial to recognize that we don't have to treat all the works alike. Different works are used by society in different ways. And the most beneficial amount of copyright power, most beneficial for society, that is, for a certain kind of work, might be different from some other kind of work. We don't have to treat them all the same. The publishers want us to assume that they have to be treated the same. They want us to imagine that it's impossible to make distinctions. But actually, that's exactly what judges are for, to make distinctions. Laws are full of distinctions. That's why they exist, to make distinctions. And applying these distinctions is not so hard. And sometimes there are distinctions that we have to make, even though there is no one obvious right place to draw the line. Consider, for instance, the law against driving while drunk. Now, there is no one place to draw the line between drunk and sober, because it's a continuum. There can't be any one right place to draw that line, but there has to be a line somewhere. So we draw one that's arbitrary. It does the job, namely that people who are drunk and driving get arrested, and people who are sober don't. So I've distinguished 3 broad categories of works based on how they were useful, not based on the medium. That's the first kind of distinction everyone thinks of. Well, I guess we could make distinctions for different kinds of media, but I think that's not a crucial difference. The difference that's important is the difference in use. These categories are, first, works that serve a practical purpose. Second, works that serve to say what certain people think. And third, works of art and entertainment. Now, these are used in different ways. The works of practical use, you use them to do a job. The works that say what certain people think, you use to find out what they think. And the works of art and entertainment, you use just for the sensation of using it. So there are different kinds of use that lead to making different rules appropriate. So I'll look at them one by one. First, works of practical use. These are also called functional works. These include programs, recipes for cooking, educational works such as manuals and textbooks, and reference works such as dictionaries and encyclopedias, and maybe other things as well. All of these works should be free. That's my conclusion. The same arguments that apply to software apply to all the works that you use to do a practical job. If you are trying to do the job today, and the work, the way it is not right for you, you need the freedom to change it, and you need that freedom today. And further, there are probably other people who want to do the same job you're doing. So you've got to be free to publish the modified version so they can all have that modified version too. So, for this category, these works should all be free. Users should be free to use them, to copy them, to distribute the copies, including commercially, and to change them and to publish the modified versions, including commercially, because commercial publication is useful for these works. Now you might ask, if we did not have a copyright system arranging for income to the authors, would these works be developed? That's like asking if airplanes would be able to fly. It's no longer an uncertainty. First, the free software community has proved that lots of these works will be developed in one area, software. And now we also have Wikipedia, the greatest encyclopedia ever, the free encyclopedia. And Wikipedia was developed in just a few years. In less than 3 years, it was the biggest encyclopedia ever developed. And it was done entirely by volunteers. Everyone is invited to contribute to Wikipedia. In the late 90s, I began writing and speaking about the need for a free encyclopedia. I wrote that it might take 20 years to develop it, but people shouldn't feel bad about that, shouldn't be discouraged by that, because it would be useful for forever, for as long as humanity lasts. Well, I was wrong. It didn't take 20 years. 3 years was enough. And we're starting to see also free textbooks. Wikipedia is now developing dictionaries too. There have been already a few free dictionaries. For instance, in one part of Belgium, the local language is a dialect related to French called Walloon. And the first time there was a generally available dictionary of Walloon, it was a free dictionary in the 90s. So it's clear now that we can develop all these kinds of functional works the same way we develop free software. We don't need to restrict the use of these works just to make sure they exist. What about the second category? The works whose use is to say what certain people think. This includes memoirs, autobiographies, essays of opinion, scientific papers which report what certain scientists saw when they did a certain thing, offers to buy and sell, and probably other things as well. Since the use of these works is to say what certain people thought, modified versions of them are not useful. They are just likely to misrepresent someone. So there's no reason why people need the freedom to modify these works. As a result, it's possible to adopt a compromise copyright system where copyright covers commercial use and modification, but everyone is free non-commercially to distribute exact copies of the work. This compromise copyright system would continue to provide an income for the authors, more or less the same as today. But it would give people the essential freedom that must never be taken away, and that is the freedom to share. With this change, copyright would once again be an industrial regulation. Once again, more painless, easy to enforce, and arguably beneficial. The third category of works is the works of art and entertainment, which includes fiction, it includes music. It does not include all movies, because some movies present factual information. They may be in this category or this category, but a lot of movies are fiction and they are in this category. For works of art and entertainment, modification raises a complicated issue. On the one hand, there's the argument that the work can have an artistic integrity, and that modifying it could destroy that integrity. And I agree that this is sometimes true. But on the other side, there is the folk process, where successive modifications of a work can produce something very rich. Meanwhile, there is also, if we look only at known authors, consider Shakespeare. Some of Shakespeare's plays used stories that were copied from other plays that had been published a few decades before. If today's copyright law had existed then, those plays would have been illegal. They would not have been presented or published. And if Shakespeare had complained, I don't know if Shakespeare would ever have complained about such a thing, but if he had complained, the copyright holders would have said, "You just want to make a cheap rip-off of my play. This would be worthless. It would destroy the integrity." And that's all we would have heard, so we probably believe it. Because Shakespeare was able to present those plays, and they were subsequently published, we can now judge them and say they're among the masterpieces of human literature, and that they're probably superior to the plays that the stories came from. But we would never know that if we had never seen those plays. We would listen to the copyright holders saying this would be a cheap ripoff, and we'd probably believe it, and we'd be wrong. But one thing is clear. It's not urgent to publish a modified version of an artistic work today, because it's not needed for a practical job. It serves the progress of art, but it's not essential to do it now. So we could have copyright last for 10 years, and during those 10 years, copyright would cover commercial use and modification. But then after 10 years, other artists would be free to make modified versions of the work. And this way, the compromised copyright system would provide income to these authors or composers or musicians to the extent that copyright does so at all. And then afterwards, the modification could start, making future works of art that are recyclings of the old ones. So that's what I recommend as the way copyright law should be changed. And that is my answer to the question, how should these ideas of free software extend to other kinds of works? For the works of practical use, the ideas extend completely. Those works must be free. For the other kinds of works, I don't go that far. A compromised copyright system could serve a useful purpose in supporting the writers and promoting writing, while at the same time pulling back enough to respect the most essential freedom, which is the freedom to non-commercially share. There are few kinds of works which are controversial today, which raise specific issues worth mentioning. For instance, millions of people share music on the internet, and this has become a battleground today. Sharing music on the internet is perfectly legitimate and must be legalized. It's an outrage for any government to forbid its citizens to share. Legalizing music sharing on the internet might cause a few superstar musicians to make less money. But in general, it will not hurt the musicians, because in general, the musicians don't make money from selling their records anyway. You might not realize this. You've probably heard the propaganda campaign saying that if you share music, you should be ashamed because you're not supporting the musicians. Well, if you buy their CD, you should be ashamed because you're not supporting the musicians. There are a few exceptions. Long-established superstars who have come to the end of their first contract, which usually covers 5 or 7 records. Once they reach the end of that contract, if they're famous, then they can negotiate a second contract which doesn't exploit them. And then they really will get some money when people buy their records. But they are just a few. Most musicians are not superstars, or even if they are superstars, they haven't got 7 records done yet. So they're in their first contract, and this first contract treats them like dirt. Nominally speaking, a certain fraction of the price of the CD is royalties for the musicians, but they never see it, because the production and publicity expenses are treated as if they were an advance to the musicians. The musicians never got that money, but it's labeled as an advance, and the royalty part of the price doesn't go to the musicians. It just moves from one account in the record company to another to repay the publicity and production expenses. Very few records sell enough copies that the musicians actually start to get any money. Some records go platinum and they don't start paying any money to the musicians. So the way the musicians make money is from their concerts and from selling records at their concerts. After all, the publicity is useful to them. These publicity expenses were spent on publicizing their music. That means more people may go to their concerts. So they will make more money, but not directly, not because you bought their record in a store. But this is not the only way to give these musicians publicity. Sharing their music gives them publicity. When one music lover says, "Listen to this, copy it, you'll love it," that's giving the musician publicity too. It also means more people go to their concerts. So we should legalize music sharing, not just because it's everyone's fundamental right to share, but even also for the health of music. See, right now, music is being crushed and poisoned by the hype industrial complex, by the music factories. They call themselves the music industry. And what does that mean? These are factories. They take in tremendous quantities of money and they squeeze it into the shape of music. And it's all crap, but people hear it advertised, promoted so much that they listen to it. Some people. music would be healthier if we got rid of this. And those arrogant record companies that say the things like what I read to you, they deserve to cease to exist. There's nothing wrong with making records and selling them. And I think it would be good if we had a copyright system that would really make those record companies support musicians, because now they don't. But today's arrogant major record companies deserve only one thing, and that's to cease to exist. So, if we legalize music sharing, most musicians won't lose anything. They'll get their publicity. First of all, record sales will probably continue to happen. But anyway, musicians will be able to get their publicity through sharing instead of through exploitive record contracts that don't give them any money. So, aside from the superstars and the record companies, we'll all be better off. But we might want to go even further. We might want to adopt systems that support music even more. So I have two ideas for ways to do that. One way is with a tax on blank media and on connection to the internet. And this tax money would be distributed to musicians and composers based on their popularity, without stopping people from sharing, and without giving any share of this money to corporations, because they don't deserve it. And one crucial point is, when we distribute this money, it should be based on popularity, but not in linear proportion. Because linear proportion means that the superstar gets a lot more than the musician who is merely great and popular. So instead we could use a mathematical function that looks like this, where it first goes up fairly fast, but then goes up more and more slowly. So the superstar who's way down there will still get more than the musician of medium popularity, but not so much more. And this means, with the same total amount of tax money, we would effectively support more musicians. Because that's the goal, after all, to support musicians so that they can be full-time musicians and practice a lot and fully perfect their abilities and do music. That's the whole purpose of having anything like copyright on music, is to support the activity of music. This is the way to use that tax money to support the activity of music in an effective way. That's one idea. Here's another idea. Imagine that everything that plays music, every box, every program, has a button you can push. And the button says, send one leva to the band. And you push it if you want to, or you don't. But why not? Of course, there are some people who are poor, and for them, even one leva, they can't afford it. Well, they won't. They won't send money, and that's good. Why should poor people be the ones who support the musicians? But those of you who are comfortable, you would send one leva, you'd never miss it. Why would you hesitate? So maybe once a month you might send one leva to some band that you're listening to. And that's probably more money than on the average people spend on music. So this would support music. And of course, right now what people spend on music, a lot of it just goes to corporations. If this system is 50% efficient, only 50% goes to the companies that transfer the money and 50% goes to the musicians, that's more money for the musicians than they're getting now. This would be a tremendous improvement in supporting musicians. So that's what I recommend. And instead of today's vicious, nasty campaigns that try to tell you that sharing is theft, if you share, they call you a pirate, which is absurd. That's like saying helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. Instead of that twisted and evil propaganda campaign, we could have a publicity campaign that works with human nature. Have you sent one leva to a band this month? If not, why not do it? Don't you like the music? Show how you like the music. Send one leva. This campaign would make everyone feel good. Another specific area where people supported by the publishers are saying that copying is a disaster is the area of movies. So let's look at the effect of legalizing movie sharing on the internet, which should be legalized. There's no legitimacy in forbidding people to share. But what would the effect be on making movies? If we had a compromised copyright system that covers commercial use, well, showing the movies in a theater, that's a commercial activity. So that would still be covered. Broadcasting them on television, that's a commercial activity. It would still be covered. Using them on airplanes, it's a commercial activity. It would still be covered. So they would still be getting a large fraction of their income. And of course, some people would still want to buy DVDs, and that's commercial sales, so it's covered. So they wouldn't lose all their income, just a fraction of it, and they keep a fraction of it. The next thing to realize is that when you see these large amounts of money that it costs to make movies, well, it's not that they have to spend that much money. They're going in a certain direction, which is very expensive, with lots of special effects. But that's not the only way to make a movie. And the next thing to realize is that even when they use lots of special effects, most of the expense is publicity, not making the movie at all. So if they only made half as much, they could do less publicity. And they could even spend the same amount of money on making the movie and they'd still make a profit. So in other words, they're going to claim that the sky is falling on them and they're exaggerating. And you must be prepared to recognize that they're exaggerating and reject it. So that pretty much concludes my speech. What time is it? Okay, I've got time for some questions. And by the way, has someone picked up my alarm clock yet? Hello? Is it? Oh, you got it. Good.